All right. You guys ready? All right, everyone. We'll get started. Another of the several things, I've talked about the things that distinguish the Aspen Security Forum from the typical forum, and another of them is that we focus exclusively on counterterrorism, only those aspects of homeland security that relate to terrorism. So we're not going to talk about illegal immigration, which is often, if not always, the prism through which border security is thought of. But instead, we're going to talk about the terrorism aspects of land borders, and we've got a superb panel to do so. Moderating this panel is Sean Waterman, who covers Homeland Security and defense matters for the Washington Times newspaper in Washington, D.C. Before joining Washington Times, Sean Waterman was a senior editor and correspondent for UPI International, and before that, he was with the BBC in London. And here in Washington as well, in the BBC's American Radio News Desk. The panel is composed of Chief Michael Fisher, who, as you see, is the Chief of U.S. Border Patrol, whose men and women are on literally the front lines of our land borders here in the United States. And subbing for Tim Healy, who had to remain in Washington at the last minute, is Cindy Coppola, who's the acting Deputy Director of the Terrorist Screening Center. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Terrorist Screening Center's place in the counterterrorism hierarchy in Washington, she will explain that during the course of the panel. And then Bob Mockney, whom you may recall from last year, those of you who were here last year, who is the director of the U.S. Visit Program at the Department of Homeland Security, responsible for keeping track of who is entering the United States. And then finally, representing the private sector perspective, is Dan Prieto, the Vice President and Practice Lead, Public Sector Strategy and Innovation at IBM, one of our sponsors. Sean, thank you very much.
Thank you, Clark. I think that's an excellent introduction. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of you to talk just very briefly, and perhaps Bob will kick off and then we'll move down towards me, about what your agency does to stop terrorists sneaking into the United States. That's what we're talking about. So why are you here?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And again, thanks to Clark Ervin for this fantastic forum. I was lucky enough to be here last year and introduce the idea of U.S. Visit and how we use biometrics. So let me talk about that and a little bit by way of background, and then, of course, get into the question. The U.S. Visit program was stood up post 9/11. It was... In fact, before I can continue, the product of a lot of people in this room. So there's a lot of people on the government side, on the private sector side, that kind of really collaborated together to allow us to put something that really had not been put up before, using biometrics in the way that we have demonstrated, which is to deploy it to all the State Department sites overseas, all the embassies and consulates, where people are now fingerprinted as part of the visa issuance process. So the fingerprints are checked against a watch list of some 6 million, and they're added to a database of a set of fingerprints that's now numbers about 128 million. When that person then arrives into the United States, those fingerprints are taken again to ensure that the person who's standing in front of the CBP officer is the person to whom the visa was legitimately given. So we have that merit.
CBP, that's the Customs and Border Protection.
Yeah, no acronyms.
Acronym-free zone.
All right. What we're able to do, again, through the State Department's initial capture, is check those fingerprints against the watch list. That watch list contains a number of known and suspected terrorists. Every day from the FBI, we get, on average, about 50 updated records from the Bureau. A lot of those are collected by the DoD in both Afghanistan and in Iraq. And those are made available to us through the system, and then by virtue of having the Department of State connected to our system, they're made available to the State Department officers there. So our job within U.S. Visit is to continue to grow the database size, whether we do that through interagency collaboration, which we have a terrific relationship with the FBI and again with the DoD, or that some of our international partners that we would do that, and especially with the 5 countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. So our job is a service to the Border Patrol, to CBP, Customs and Border Protection, to the State Department, to an increasing number of stakeholders, so that as they execute their mission, they can know to whom they're granting the benefit or to whom who they're dealing with. and know for sure. And then if we have that information about a known and suspected terrorist, that we would be able to provide that information to them.
Thank you. Cindy.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you to Clark and the Aspen Institute for the invite for the FBI and the Terror Screening Center. I'm here today, I guess, on behalf of Tim Healy, as Clark had mentioned. The conception and maybe the misconceptions and the skepticism of the watch list, I'll kind of give you an overview, I guess you want to say a 101 on watch listing. And it'll give you a better perspective on how, what the process is and what it does. In 2003, the President signed a Homeland Security Presidential Directive, number 6, and that allowed for the Terror Screening Center to be evolved, to come together. And so in December of 2003, it started. And what that led was basically is the link between local law enforcement, state law enforcement, your tribal law enforcement, federal, and the intelligence community. Where there was no link before, there now existed a link. And that presidential directive allowed 12 watch lists to be put into one. So before, where all the intelligence communities might have had a different watch list and they all didn't have the same personnel or subjects on that list, we now had it consolidated. It was a consolidated approach. And at the same time, it protects civil liberties and also in a lawful manner. So in a guaranteed atmosphere on a daily basis, we probably receive 1,000 to 1,500 nominations to the watch list daily. They come from the international community for the international terrorism side of the House, as well as domestic terrorism. The domestic terrorism nominations come only from the FBI. So we have analysts there that will work these nominations to make sure they're current, thorough, and accurate with that information. There can be additions to the list, it could be modifications, or it could be deletions. So people are taken off the list daily as well as being added. Right now, I think we probably have about 480,000 people on the list. Out of that list, there's probably, I would say, an approximate maybe 16,000 no-flies and 16,000 selectees. And that's the TSA's holdings where the no-fly, where the people cannot fly, and the different screening processes. And we'll get into that later. With that, a daily encounter process that can occur will be your local law enforcement. Let's take a Montana state trooper. He stops somebody for speeding in the middle of the night on the highway. Whether he has the ability or his dispatcher has the ability to run a criminal history report on that person that he stopped. They run the history report, comes back, and they're looking for wants and warrants. Now they're looking also for the number, is this person a hit to the watch list? The number for the Terror Screening Center pops up. You'll see that number. The law enforcement officer is then directed to call the Terror Screening Center. So that's your first link, because they are the boots on the street. They are the people that are stopping these bad guys, so to speak, and that we are not in the intelligence community seeing because we're behind the scenes. So that law enforcement officer calls the Terror Screening Center. One of our center operations specialists who answers the calls, we're 24/7, 365 days a year, would take one of those calls from a law enforcement officer and then gather information. Intelligence can be gathered. Is that individual in a vehicle with somebody else? Is that person the correct person that might be on the watch list? They're not sure. But a good success stories come out of that, where you might have someone who is an investigative subject that is stopped just for traffic speeding, and that person is in a car with another subject. So you have a case agent from the FBI in New York does not know that his subject was stopped in Montana that night. Because what happens after it leaves the Terror Screening Center, it's then filtered down through the FBI, through the case agent, and then back around to all the intelligence community and back into the terror screening database where we hold the nominations. That subject could have been with another subject from California. That is never known unless the law enforcement officers call in, and that's how the encounter process works. So that is the link between local and the state law enforcement and the intelligence community.
Thank you. Now, Dan, what I would like you to do really is to talk a little bit about technology and its role in this process, as I said, of trying to keep the integrity of the border, keep terrorists out of the United States.
So per that, I thought it might make sense for Chief Fisher, since he's representing a particular agency, to go before me, and then I can try to put a wrap around
If he's all right with that, then I'm cool with it too.
It's pretty slick. Good afternoon. It is indeed an honor to be here. Again, my name is Mike Fisher, and I proudly represent 21,370 Border Patrol agents who patrol each and every day to protect America. One of the things, when you look at the United States Border Patrol and our mission, you know, and I've been sitting this morning listening to the targeted of terrorists and what we do from an intelligence perspective and a broad U.S. government approach. What's interesting when you look at the Border Patrol in a larger law enforcement community is we are non-investigative in nature, which means we do not train Border Patrol agents to go out and patrol for terrorists and then train a different group to go out and patrol for transnational criminals in organizations that would move other things like individuals and people in contraband. So what's interesting, the way that we play into this, and we're learning each and every day, by the way, is how do we in an all-threats environment make sure that that workforce, which by the way today 55% of the workforce has less than 5 years experience, how do we train that workforce to recognize that those threats are still out there? How do we leverage and recognize the importance of intelligence in a law enforcement community, which in generally, when you get information, it goes into a case file and will never see the light of day until a successful prosecution? How do you leverage and recognize that both intelligence, interdiction, and investigative components no longer can exist in a mutually exclusive environment because of the new threat that we're facing right now? What we specifically do in terms of our policies subsequent to an arrest, because you can imagine every arrest that a Border Patrol agent that he or she makes tonight, we are not going to know sometimes in hours or days who that individual is that's been encountered. So our first and primary responsibility subsequent to the arrest is to figure out who these individuals are, to be able to then categorize the extent to which there is a threat in that individual or group of individuals that are being walked out of a canyon in southeast Arizona, for instance. And we do that with Bob's help, and up until recently, we take the biometrics and we bounce them off of not just the systems that DHS owns, and not just the system that DOJ owns, but also recently to include the Department of Defense. So we're getting a lot smarter about those individuals that are seeking entry between the ports of entry, and in some cases to do harm to the country. I look forward to participating on this panel, and thank you, Sean.
Okay.
Great. So my name's Dan Prieto. I represent IBM and a voice from industry. We support more than a dozen threat prevention and prediction programs around the federal government, at DHS, in the law enforcement community, in the intelligence community. And with that point of view, I'd like to ask everyone in the audience to just sort of recalibrate your thinking about what is border security. I think the images that most quickly come to mind for most people are, as Clark said, southern border, illegal immigration, walls, barbed wire. I think other images that might come to the fore quickly are a New Yorker cartoon, sort of taking a jab at someone getting frisked when they come back from overseas travel. Or perhaps it's the pretty big alphabet soup of programs and organizations that are involved in the different parts of the border enterprise. But when you get past all of that, I think it's striking to note that outside of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and our military activities, the border security enterprise, broadly writ and in totality, is the largest security activity investment since 9/11. And why is that? It's because it's a complex set of missions with a dizzying array of stakeholders. Everything from State Department taking visa applications overseas, vetting those visa applications, comparing the information they get from interviews against terrorist watch lists, DHS lists, data from around the entire federal government to decide whether or not the person is a danger to the states and whether they can come to the country. It includes, obviously, Customs and Border Protection, the U.S. visit program that Bob was talking about. When people come to the country and they get vetted, okay, you have a visa, but let's check again what the information says about you. And not only is it biographic information, it's also biometric information. Fingerprints, facial pictures of people's faces that are compared against large databases. And if you think about the border enterprise that way, to my mind, the border security enterprise is the U.S. government's largest, most important, and fastest growing data-intensive operation. Now, if we think about the commercial sector, we're familiar with what private companies do with big data all the time. You have Walmart using supply chain data and store data to determine what's the best thing for our customers to buy. There was a notable story after Hurricane Katrina where they started looking into what do people need when there are hurricanes. They were surprised to find out that other than the water, one of the biggest things they bought was Pop-Tarts, right? We also know, for example, Amazon.com. They use targeted customer data. 30% of all their sales come from using customer data and targeting things that other people bought. Bob bought this, maybe you'd want to buy this. That accounts for 30% of their sales. So to me, this large border enterprise and its reliance on data and analysis and analytics is really the government's signal example. Its poster child that's the equivalent of these very successful commercial programs. And the border enterprise speaks to the government's unique mission, protect the country, its national security, and it speaks to what I mentioned before, threat prevention and prediction and prevention. And it is the interaction of all these different programs that we've just heard about with technology, IT systems, lots of data that's growing pretty dramatically that makes all of this work. Now, when we talk about some of the big trends in data, those same trends exist in the private sector. And I'll very quickly use State Department as an example. So if data in the private sector is growing at this point 40, 50% per year, it will increase, I think, fivefold over the next 10 years. The same thing is happening in government. Let's just take, for example, State Department databases. When they look at visas, their overall database is the Consolidated Consular Database. It includes, let me just find my statistics here. It's 100 terabytes of visa information. It's among the largest of all federal databases, 143 million records accumulated over the last 13 years. It is growing by 6 to 7 terabytes per month. It will double in about the next 5 years. We talk about information sharing, and that information getting shared among law enforcement, intelligence, DHS. There are only 11,000 state users of this system. There are 20,000 users that come from outside of the State Department. They come from everywhere, DOD, DHS, FBI, DOJ, Commerce. In terms of biometrics, State Department has 142 million images in facial recognition files. It is the largest facial recognition organization in the world today. So again, all those databases are constantly pinging data that resides elsewhere in the government. And in order to make all that work, you need to be very cognizant of how you architect systems, the skill levels of people you employ to get better decision-making out of all that data. And that's an area that IBM helps. So with that orientation, I look forward to chatting further with you.
Well, thank you all. That's very good. Cindy, can I start with a follow-up to you?
Sure.
You talked about thousands of additions or deletions every day, 480,000 people on the watch list. How often do police officers in this country encounter someone on the terrorist watch list?
Right now, law enforcement encounters make up maybe, I would say, 15 to 20%. On a daily basis, we could have 170 or maybe 150 to 175 encounters per day that come in. That's either border crossings, it could be U.S. visit, as Bob mentioned, it could be CBP, where the border crossings, it could be at the airports, or it could be the local law enforcement. Local law enforcement is only a small portion where we get our encounters. So on a yearly basis, I think the Terror Screening Center probably has about approximately 50,000 encounters per year. And out of those encounters, we're probably about a 39% positive rate. So you're looking at, let's say it's 150 to 175 a day, 39% of those are positive hits to the watch list.
That means that the person encountered is the person on the watch
Correct.
List and not someone with the same or similar
Correct,
name.
exactly. And as mentioned earlier by John Pistol today, when he spoke about Secure Flight is a great program. We probably get, I would say, 10 encounters a day from Secure Flight, and they are doing the pre-screening for misidentification. So when we're flying, we're putting in our name, date of birth, and gender. That pre-screens before it even comes to the Terror Screening Center, so they can eliminate a lot of those misidentifications. And that's a great program that we work with now.
So that figure, just to be clear, that includes people at the board, people trying to enter the United States, people trying to get on planes, and people who who are run against wants and warrants by local law enforcement.
Correct, and it could be visa applications, because we have State Department people that work with us. They go against that. Someone mentioned earlier about different credentialing today with regards to someone who works at an airport. All airport workers are screened in that sense when it's working with TSA and
a commercial driver's
correct.
License, hazmat.
Yep.
Okay,
all
but
that.
that's still, I mean, that's an enormous number, isn't it? And these are international terrorists, right? Not domestic, or both.
They could be both. It could be both, and
Can you say anything about the proportions there?
Proportions, no, I don't really have any numbers off the top of my head, and I don't know what the breaking down is with regards to how many would be. I would definitely venture to guesstimate that the international hits are much higher than a domestic terrorism hit, just by sheer numbers, because the majority of our nominations are international and domestic instead of domestic in nature.
And can you say how many of those 480,000 people are international as opposed to domestic?
Overall, and this is where the misconception comes in for everybody here with regards to protecting civil liberties, there's probably only about approximately 6,000 U.S. people on the entire list out of that 480,000. And out of that, maybe 400 are no-flies. So when we get, you hear the stories that somebody got stopped, that might not necessarily be because they're on the watch list. They could have been stopped for other reasons.
Right. Or because they have a similar or same or similar name.
Correct.
Okay. Now, and you say about 39% of those are positive hits, so it is the person. And then, I mean, can you, you gave a hypothetical example, I think, during your opening about, you know, an FBI case officer who finds that someone he's investigating is associating with someone else. I mean, are you able to give us any real anecdotes, you know, about ways in which this process has sort of...
That actually is a true story. There was a case that we've used, and there was a subject from Arizona that was stopped, and he was in the car with a subject from California and New York. Nobody knew that all three were related, so that's good intelligence for every case officer or case agent that's working those investigations. They didn't know that his New York subject was in California, and they didn't know that they all knew each other. So that intelligence is good information that you get from the local law enforcement, where we never had that link before into the intelligence community.
Okay, thanks. Bob, if I can turn to you, one of the issues that comes up, I guess, periodically in relation to US visit is this question of the exit system, because at the moment you guys are only taking people's fingerprints and their facial recognition when they enter, and when they leave, all you've got is a name. That's about right? Yeah. I mean, in fact, if people leave over the land border, you probably don't even have that.
Right. As we all know, the U.S. does not have a standard exit control system like you might find in Hong Kong, many parts of Europe, Australia, and other places. We do have an exit system, though, and it is in partnership with the airlines, where we do get the information biographically. The compliance rate with getting that information to Customs and Border Protection is dramatically increased over the years, and it's well into the 99 to 100% of everybody who's leaving by plane. You're right about the land border. You can drive across the border. There are some locations where the I-94, the arrival departure form that one gets when it arrives here, is turned in to the Canadian officer. That Canadian officer might walk it back over. We're working very strongly with them to try and improve that way. But I want to make sure that people understand that we do have an exit system on the airports, which is the place we're mostly concerned about for those who are going to be flying in here and may be involved in international terrorism. We, every single day at U.S. Visit, get an exception report from the arrival departure information system that we employ. So we have a biometric side, which I've talked about, but we also have a strong biographical side. We have people cull through that information, and because certain countries are of higher priorities than others, we'll focus on those particular countries. We will then kind of wean that down through looking through a series of databases. It goes to Dan's point about needing to sometimes automate some of this process because it can be labor intensive. But at the end of the day, we send about 300 records over to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials, who can then build case folders and then go and find those individuals. And the most recent statistics from 2009 had about 750 people encountered, and later on we're putting through a deportation proceeding, having overstayed their visas, sometimes as long as 3 years or more. So there is a process in place to identify people who are here egregiously overstaying their visas. We recently, the Undersecretary Beers testified in Congress about another process in which we employ different systems at Customs and Border Protection and also at the NCTC itself, where we can run those names of individuals who may have overstayed. And that's always the issue, may have overstayed, because they may have left through some ways, or they may have adjusted their status, or they may have left over the land border, and we don't have that information. But we ran those numbers through there and identified several individuals who were of interest. Again, turn that over to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement folks for follow-on. So a process in place to do that. Is it as exact as biometrics for everybody leaving the country? Well, obviously not. There's going to be some people who are going to have similar names. They're going to fly in with their U.S. passport. They're going to exit the country with their U.K. passport because they may be a dual citizen. And so there are some holes in the system, but overall, I would say it's pretty strong, and we have a good program in place, again, working in partnership with Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
But there is a congressional mandate, isn't there, for a biometric exit system?
There is.
Where is the department at with its decision-making process about that?
We conducted several pilots, have been conducting several pilots over the course of several years, looking at different technologies. As I said, the infrastructure is not there. We have TSA, but there's nothing beyond it. There's no booths to walk through. There's no passport control. So we tested several different methodologies, modalities. We use kiosks. After TSA, we use mobile devices, handheld devices at the gate. We use basically a jump kit, so kind of a laptop with the fingerprint device for there. The technology works. We can capture fingerprints at the airports. We can bounce it against the watch list, and in a couple of instances, we actually made arrests based on active wants and warrants of individuals.
So these were people seeking to leave the country with a warrant out for them, who were caught because in these pilot projects at a handful of airports you were collecting fingerprints.
Correct. 12 airports and 2 seaports we did this at. So we know the technology works. That's not the issue. It's frankly not inexpensive to put something like this up. And we all have to make tough decisions in this austere budgetary time frame that we're in right now. And so if we have an extra dollar to spend, are we going to put that towards the exit program or put it towards another program? And that's kind of where we're at right now. We're looking for a cost-effective way. We're working with our S&T, science and technology partners, to evaluate some of the reports that we did, see if there are other ways that we maybe have missed, but looking for a more cost-effective solution.
Just let me press you once more on that. Do you expect a decision soon or ever? I mean, it's kind of hard for the department to turn around and basically tell Congress they're not going to do something which is a mandate.
No, and we have not abandoned the idea of biometric exit. We have decided to pursue and enhance the biographical side, working again with our other partners, but the decision has not been to not do it. So we have decided that we're going to pursue it. We're going to do it at the right time, when we have the right money, when the technology is maybe a little bit more affordable. But no, we certainly have not made a decision to not do it.
Okay. Chief Fisher, if I can turn to you. Let's talk about, because there are two, very distinct parts of the country that you work on, right? The northern border and the southern border. So in terms of terrorism specifically, which of those is the greater concern to you, and why?
I think when you look at the northern border and the southern border, each present unique challenges, but really that's where we turn to the intelligence community. You know, it used to be a few years ago when we were looking at the post-2003, when the department first stood up and the Border Patrol built its national strategy in 2004, we identified the threat differently from the northern border and the southern border. And quite simplistically, the northern border, because of the population centers and because of what we knew and what the intelligence community was telling us, there were certain areas that we would give more focus and more resources because of the potential nexus of crossings from Canada into the United States. But along the southern border, the threat at the time was defined as the overwhelming amount of activity, people coming across. So that was defined as the threat. Now, as we've gotten smarter over the years and we've looked at maturing the strategy, matter of fact, our new strategy really looks, and Director Pistol mentioned this, and we've heard this morning, and really looking at a risk-based approach as opposed to a resourcing philosophy approach to, putting Border Patrol agents every 50 meters or so and standing a post and adding cameras every quarter of a mile. And so what we look at now, the threat on the northern and southern border, it's really The vulnerabilities exist not necessarily in the absence of Border Patrol agents and technology. Really, the vulnerabilities exist to the extent that the threat has been identified, and then our capacity and capability to respond to that threat anywhere along the northern and southern border. And that then becomes the new paradigm shift within our strategy. So I can't tell you today what's more threatening on the northern or southern border, because when you look at geography, and our earlier strategy was taking away the opportunity, or we were attacking the crime and not necessarily the criminal or the criminal organizations. That's why when we established a gain, maintain, and expand philosophy, we were going to take turf, and we were going to take terrain, and we were going to hold on to that, and we were going to expand terrain. Well, back then, that served us well because, one, the threat in terms of the southern border was really focused predominantly in the urban areas, and we just were met with overwhelming force, so the strategy back then said we need more stuff. And so the strategy was predicated on personnel, technology, and infrastructure. I'm sure many of you heard that over the years. And so where we find ourselves today, because of the levels of activity that have been reduced, the increase in resources that we've seen both in terms of Border Patrol agents, in terms of infrastructure, both fencing, secondary and primary roads, giving Border Patrol agents more access to those areas, and also in terms of technology. Now we have that stuff. We have increased our capability within the organization more so than I ever thought possible while I was still going to be in uniform. So now we look at the changed environment within the border. We see more capability and capacity. So how then do we use those resources? So now the cornerstone of our strategy talks about information, and parenthetically, we talk about intelligence, because that's going to be a critical piece to then define the threat, for us then to be able to assess the vulnerabilities along those very open and porous borders. And the second piece on that is going to be integration. And I'm not just talking about the technology integration, which has really drove the conversation over the first few years. That's still going to be important, but now we talk in terms of operational integration, which takes us beyond cooperating and coordinating with our state and local partners and other law enforcement, because we have to be able to plan and execute jointly. That's the difference between cooperation and integration. And lastly, the last pillar within the strategy is our rapid response capabilities. So now we have a workforce, we're spread out. How then do we take what the military has done over the last few years and take lessons learned, which is the reason why we're working very closely with Northcom and General Swan, Army North, and General Bills down in JTF North in El Paso, to help us take some of those lessons and apply it to a law enforcement scenario that has as its priority mission to be able to patrol in between the legitimate ports of entry against those people that would try to come through there in illegal means.
Let me ask you a little bit about, you talked about integration. Now, and my understanding is, at least on the northern border, there's some integration with the Canadians, right?
Certainly.
You have these ship rider, which are joint waterborne patrols on the lakes. You have the IBIS teams, which are joint intelligence-based policing. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly. The Border Patrols certainly didn't make this up, but we also recognized years ago that given the mission and given what's facing this country in terms of legitimate threats on a daily basis, we were not going to do this by ourselves. Now, we've worked tirelessly with our international partners in terms of getting that information a lot quicker to help the interdictors in the field try to figure out where to deploy finite resources. So in terms of our Canadian partners, and certainly working with the RCMP, both in terms of working collaboratively on intelligence sharing and having cross-component exchange programs so that we understand better about their culture and how the borders, we're not looking at it anymore as a juridical line where that line in the sand separates one country from the next. And certainly the way that you look at those borders is going to be different whether you're dealing with the Canadian government or you're dealing with the Mexican government. But the point has to be made that you can no longer just play defense at the border and expect that that's going to be your first line of defense, when in a lot of cases, if you look at the corridor and you look at the transportation throughout from the point of decision when that person or that piece of cargo decided that it was going to leave, we have to be able to figure out how much information we can gather along the process. So then the border and coordinating with our international partners then becomes a corridor effect and trying to prevent the entry in the first instance, not at the border itself, which then becomes really the last line of defense.
And do you I mean, do you find that those joint operations, that integration, is that harder on the southern border than on the northern border? I mean, I'm assuming that the Mexican authorities are less well equipped in terms of their, technology and their training and so forth.
I wouldn't characterize it as harder or easier in comparing or contrasting that. It's just different. Each country, when you're dealing with it, whether it's our contiguous to our borders or dealing with Central and South America throughout those smuggling corridors, they present unique challenges. And what you have to do is you have to recognize what those challenges are, recognize the individuals that you're dealing with. But it all comes down to establishing trust. Sharing information and being able to really make a difference. You can talk about building fusion centers or changing blocks on an organizational chart and building capacity. But when you really, and this is just from a ground pounder talking, from the street level, if I'm trying to get information from one of my partners and they're trying to get some information from me, really that has to be established over time. And there's a lot of risk in doing that in the law enforcement community, quite frankly. And I'm probably telling you something you haven't heard before. But if I give up information and I give that to an investigative agency, which then ends up arresting Mr. Big and denies me the big pile of dope and money that I was going to take a picture of, there's some equity that I have to lose in sharing that information and vice versa. And when you broaden that among all the law enforcement partners, and then you factor in the international component, therein lies the challenge. And so what we try to do is recognize that, hey, this isn't about glory and honor, about who can make the biggest bust. And by the way, none of us really are going to be able to make that dent alone. But only until we're able to share that information and recognize the challenges locally, and you build that trust over time, and then you build on it.
Can you talk a little bit more about the other risks there? I mean, it's not just losing the credit, isn't it? It might be, the information might be compromised. Certainly. If it's shared with an organisation which is infiltrated, for instance, or certainly, where where communications aren't secure. Can you? Certainly,
sharing information, like anything else, there is an amount of risk, and what you try to do is figure out, if I'm going to give up a piece of information at whatever level, and certainly what we're talking about here is generally non-classified information. So when we're talking about the intelligence, when we're talking about law enforcement information, generally when we share that information with our international partners, generally it's sensitive but unclassified. But there's still a risk to divulging those types of, TTs and Ps and some of the things that we do as an organization.
TTs and Ps?
Tactics, techniques, and procedures. I'm sorry. And so when we give the information, for instance, to, let's say it's going to be SEDENA, the equivalent of our military in Mexico, or SSP, the equivalent of the federal police in Mexico, or the local and state, each one of those components has its own risk associated with it. And so what we have to be able to do is figure out, if we're going to give them that information, what is it that we're asking them to do? If we're asking them to go hit a high-value target, is that something that we're going to do at the local level? Well, probably not if it's at the national scope and at the national targeting level. But if it's something at the local level, for them to be able to identify and maybe do a sweep through a colonia where we know that there's stash houses and there's potential individuals that are being held against their will for extortion, then we're going to give up that information because it's less risky. Because we're not giving up anything that we would, hope to hold out on if we didn't give them that information. So it really depends, and each one of those locations is very unique. The border is not the same across the board along the south or across the north. And as different as our communities are within this country, the border's no different. And really understanding how that operates and who's in charge and what are the risks and who are the power players and how and what type of information we're willing as an organization to share up is it's not an easy call, and it's something that we assess every day.
Bob, can I ask you about the same? Thank you very much, Chief Fisher. Bob, can I ask you the same question really about international cooperation? You mentioned it briefly in your opening, but how is that working? Are you sharing your data with other countries and getting data from them? Tell me about that.
Sure. And I mentioned this last year as well. When we first stood the program up in 2003, 2004, a lot of negative reaction to the program. The idea that you could be fingerprinting tourists was a little bit wasn't taken very well by a lot of the countries. Shortly after we deployed in December of 2003, we had a series of hits. We were able to, and we had a worldwide campaign, frankly, that we went around the world to kind of let people know why we were doing this and how we were doing it and how the information was protected, always concerned about the privacy and civil liberties aspect of it, and travel and tourism too. I mean, we need to have that economic security as well. But as they saw that these hits were occurring, they really began to question themselves, should they not employ the same tactics that we did. And shortly after we did that, Japan was the first country to deploy a program that uses two fingerprints, as we first started with two fingerprints ourselves. And then the UK decided that they were going to do it. They went directly to 10 prints, as we have now ourselves gone to. Canada is actively building their program as we speak. Australia is actively building their program as we speak, and New Zealand is set to begin doing this. And the EU is still contemplating. They haven't yet deployed, but they have a system ready to go. So the world has recognized the power of biometrics and really what it can do to enhance their border and immigration processes, both as a deterrent and as an actual capture, and sometimes in many ways a convenience factor as well. So with that, we of course have set about with this idea of sharing as much information as we possibly can. I often say when I speak to groups about the ethics of information sharing, and certainly there are some differences between ourselves and many of the countries I've just mentioned, but I also ask the question, what are the ethics of not sharing information? If I have information on a bad guy and I don't share that with a partner country, aren't I somewhat culpable in that regard? And so we have as robust an information sharing program as we possibly can. We have, and I believe I mentioned this again last year as well, the UK now at 130 application support centers that they have throughout the US will send those individuals who need a visa to go to the UK, and they are fingerprinted at these application support centers, which are actually run by U.S. Immigration the USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration can't think of the acronym. Service. Thank you. And so the fingerprints are running against that. They're running against our ident database. Had several hits on many applicants for the UK. Australia is also sending us prints. We have a program called the High Value Data Protocol, in which any one of the 5 countries, or four of the countries, can send data and ping that information against the ident process system. And so the information sharing protocols are very strong. They're growing as more and more countries begin to develop their programs. We stand ready to assist with them. We have an office called Information Sharing and Technical Assistance. So we send people to these various countries to help them develop their program, and then they in turn get access to the system. So I would say a pretty successful program to date. It will continue to grow as more and more countries decide to employ biometrics as part of their immigration border management process.
Dan, one theme that's emerging here very strongly, I think, is information sharing. And I mean, I remember being told, I believe by Karen Evans back in 2002, that the technology was there to do information sharing. What was lacking was the policy, was the will, was that. How are we doing on that? Are there still gaps? Are there still seams? How are we doing on the information sharing enterprise 10 years out from that, the whole joining the dots being one of the key issues that let those 19 hijackers into the country and enabled them to...
On the policy and legal front, I think we're in good stead on that front. I think if you look at 9/11 and the series of moves by the United States government soon after that, our first steps were to, based on 9/11 Commission recommendations and other findings, look at law, look at policy, implement new law, implement new policy, and implement sort of different business rules at a lot of the organizations that contributed to the overall border security enterprise. So I think the environmental factors that are policy and law are in place. And I think what's happened in the years since that is a significant amount of maturation around how people operationalize information, operationalize sharing. And I think, to borrow a quote from Bill Gates, we always, particularly on IT, overestimate what we'll achieve in 5 years, but underestimate what we'll achieve in 10. And I think at the 10-year anniversary of 9/11 coming up very soon, I think we've progressed quite far. I think the common theme you'll hear from every one of the speakers up here is that information itself is a strategic asset that's as important as your workforce and as important as your capital assets, number one. Number two, I think if you would go talk to any individual that works in any of these organizations or programs, they will be proud of the success that's been made, but if you ask them what their fears are, I think they still exist around the connecting the dots issue. They're afraid that potentially if something happened, let's say Christmas Day bomber, that they were the organization or the person that didn't connect that dot or didn't find that piece of information, because the press and the United States public has a very high bar in terms of pointing fingers if there is a lone piece of information in a database for some far-flung place that wasn't leveraged to its full capacity. I think the second great fear you'll find, particularly after things like WikiLeaks, is as more information is shared, but even beyond the sharing, as just more volume of information is out there, and this is true in the private sector as well, it's a lot easier to either have it lost or stolen. And you don't run away with a couple sheets of paper. You now run away with a disk or a hard drive that has tens or hundreds of thousands of things, or millions even. And I think the other pressure that's right now you're going to see going forward on the border security community is the budget pressure. The pressure is on, and it's ruthless to do more with less. And I think what a couple years ago was sort of defense in depth, overlapping layers in a security framework, now potentially gets pointed out as a redundancy. So I think to address those concerns, which will always exist in the border security enterprise, you have to do a couple things with confidence. Number one, for all the data we have, you have to be able to integrate it and make sure it interoperates very well. I think the kind of steps you've seen on that front is less paper forms and more electronic data. State Department Consular Affairs has moved to a full electronic, for example, visa application process. That's important because if it's electronic, you can do a lot more easy search of those items. I think another piece of progress is standards. The National Information Exchange Mechanism, a standard that was developed by DHS and DOJ, has now become a quickly growing standard for data interoperability between government organizations, and it's now even expanded into areas like healthcare. I think the next piece that you want to be confident of is what we at IBM called entity resolution. Is this person who they say they are? And in order to increase your accuracy of that, I understand State Department is exploring greater use of commercial data to say that this Sean Waterman is this Sean Waterman and this Dan Prieto is this Dan Prieto. And another example from state, if you look at travel patterns, travel from China is growing 30% per year. Brazil, India, you're getting massive amounts of growth travel from places with names that don't fit the sort of Western archetype of names. So what you saw after the Christmas Day bomber incident was a move to better name search algorithms and more fuzzy name search algorithms. So even if they weren't spelled exactly the same, you still found your matches. The next big piece that you want to have confidence in is business intelligence and analysis of the data you have. Can you use software and IT to allow you to find relationships in information that, if you threw 100 analysts with magnifying glasses, they just couldn't find it because the volumes of data are so high. So we can do more of that going forward. I think all the organizations that are represented up here are doing more of that. The program manager for information sharing is pushing for more of that. And in terms of using computers to better augment human decision making, one thing you saw after Christmas Day bomber was now basically there was derogatory information that says, you know what, this guy has a visa, there's new information in the system, maybe we should think about revoking his visa. That happens now automatically. There's retroactive visa review when there are updates of derogatory information in the terrorist screening databases. It is now run retroactively against all past and previous visa applications. And finally, on the security front, you have to be confident of role-based access, again, related to WikiLeaks. Who has access to the data? Are the business rules mature? You can't just put it out there on a front porch. Nobody should be being able to stick thumb drives in and download massive amounts. And there's certainly tons of commercial technology that can view anomalies in terms of why is this person downloading 8 gigs of data? That's not in their job description. So all those things together give me confidence that at year 10 we've really made significant progress.
Bob, let me put this question to you. I mean, this is a little bit unfair, but I want to talk about the case of Ra'ad Ramadan Alwan, who was this Iraqi in Kentucky who was allowed into the US as a refugee from Iraq, and who it later turned out his fingerprints were on a cell phone that had been used in an IED in Iraq. And that cell phone had been sitting in a US government warehouse. Now, you're not USCIS, who granted him his immigration privileges. You're not the FBI. You're not DOD.
Not the FBI.
But you are the fingerprint guy. So, and you are from DHS. So, what happened?
What happened? That is unfair, but mindful of the fact, first of all, that the refugee screening process has vastly improved over time, and we get better and better every time. New databases are looked at, new processes are looked on how to screen them. We have an obligation in the States, and we've had this going back in our history of bringing in refugees to the U.S. And so we have to build new systems, we have to look at new data, we have to get new data. All I can say on this particular case, and this really is something that is better addressed by the CIS, who handles the refugee program, or the Bureau, who does handle some of the intake of some of these prints. We can provide the data back when we have the data. And I'll kind of give you, by illustration, another incident that may help explain it. When the program first stood up, we had a Costa Rican apply for a visa in San Jose, Costa Rica. Took the 2 prints at the time, wasn't 10, but 2 prints. No hit. Gave the guy a visa. Went home, packing his bags. Subsequent to that, Interpol sent us a tranche of fingerprint information. He wasn't a Costa Rican. He was a Bulgarian national who had absconded with 13 million euros 10 years prior and then created a new identity in San Jose. And the only reason we knew that is because we have this wrap back feature which says, have we seen this person before when we get new information? So the timing of when we get the data and when that data is made available is very crucial to decision-making process. So the trick really is to get that information in as quickly as possible. But I don't know what piece of an IED was left by the roadside that maybe wasn't picked up that might have a print on it. So we have a great system. We have a terrific interoperable system with the FBI. As I said, we get on average 50 prints a day. We get prints from the DOD. And so the mechanisms are there, the processes are there. It's when that information can be made available and when that decision maker has to make a decision that becomes kind of crucial. So that's about the best way I can explain it. It really is, if we have the data, we'll be able to give that information to the decision maker and they can make the best decision possible.
So there's a backlog, is what you're saying. There's a lot of this stuff.
There's a lot of information. We didn't do this before. We didn't, when I was an inspector in San Francisco, I just kind of happily stamped people into the country, not knowing that they may have criminal records in their history. Well, now, at 4 locations, and soon next year at all ports of entry, a CBP officer will take the 10 prints of an individual and in real time be checked against the 69 million fingerprints that the FBI holds to see if, in fact, they have criminal history. And in the 4 locations that we have done this so far, and an immense amount of success with that. So, technology changes, and what you had back in 2003, you don't have now. What we had in 2010, we didn't have back in 1995 when I was an inspector. So technology improves, and we try to adapt that technology. That's why we always look to industry to help us with that. We'll always put the mission requirement out there, and for you to understand that, so you to come back here and tell us what you have and what's the latest and greatest technology out there. But a lot of information is out there. A lot of good work is being done by a lot of people overseas and in country. But can we process everything instantaneously? It takes time.
Sean, can I add to that
Please.
real quick? The watch list also holds fingerprints, pictures, and iris scans. Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 24 was biometrics. So now the watch list is capable of that. But again, that's where the technology comes into place. Can we export it to all our downstream customers? Can they hold it? Can they see it? And that's the process, the challenges that we're facing as well.
I think I'm going to ask one more question before we turn to the audience. Chief Fisher, can you talk a little bit about one of the things that I've heard from local law enforcement people is that there's a lot of concern about the possibility or the potential of a nexus between terrorist organizations and criminal organizations, drug smuggling. I mean, I remember one fellow saying to me that the best way to get a terrorist into the country would be to hide him in a bale of marijuana, right? I mean, can you talk a little bit, I mean, is that a real danger that the terrorists will link up with drug gangs or human smugglers? Can you talk a little bit about that?
In general terms, I can. I mean, that you're going to, I think one of the heart of our priority intelligence requirements with our new strategy is, one, if in fact, let's just make the assumption that at some point in our lifetime that a terrorist is going to seek entry in the United States, and they're not going to try an airplane, they're not going to try some, legitimate counterfeit, try to get through a port of entry, they're going to try to come through, one of our borders in between the ports of entry, either through Canada or through Mexico. And so then the question is, if we make that assumption, then the question is, well, which criminal organization, who owns what plaza in terms of the South, is more likely, and do we know enough about that organization? How likely is the Sinaloa cartel, or how likely is the Juarez cartel to actually do that? Will they actually do anything for money? I mean, one of our vulnerabilities, clearly, is we just don't know enough about the criminal organizations in which we encounter. Because we've been dealing so much with the forward deployed terrain denial aspect of our strategy. And that's not a pejorative statement. That's just the reality. And so right now, when we look at where do we want to go within the next 5 to 10 years, is we have to know more about the threat, the intent and capability of our adversary. Who are they? Where are they? And these types of questions we ask the intelligence community to assess for us so that we then can be able to figure out how we plan and execute integrated operations against the greatest threat. And right now, there's a whole host outside of taking a look at Clancy's new Against All Enemies. I still think there's always the potential that is in fact out there. So then we start talking about what is the high probability, low impact versus the low probability, high impact threats. And there's a whole host of folks, I'm sure, that have an opinion in this room I'd love to talk about later based on your question.
Well, let me just ask you one last question, and Bob as well. I mean, has the Border Patrol ever caught a terrorist or a suspected terrorist trying to sneak across the border? And Bob, has US Visit ever caught a terrorist or a suspected terrorist at a port of entry?
I'll go first. First of all, US Visit doesn't catch terrorists. We provide the information so that Mike can, or the officers can, or state can. When we first deployed the program, as I said before, we had a global campaign. We did it for 2 reasons. We did that to reassure the good tourist that their information will be protected and why we're doing it, and we wanted to explain it and have that conversation. But it was also to send a very strong signal out there that we were standing something up that was going to be very, very certain, that if you were going to attempt to enter the country or try to get a visa, and that we would have this very critical information on you, then you would be caught. So how many of those who may have come decided not to come, I can't tell you. But certainly the deterrence factor is going to be a very, very strong feature of the program. I can say this, one of the other programs that we have is a latent print file. So we get access, again, to all the DoD prints. We have latent print examiners who look at those fingerprints. They'll bounce those latent prints against all of the 128 million records that we have today and growing at about 20 to 30 million per year. And in that regard, we haven't identified anyone that was in those tourists who come to the United States, but we did identify a print that was found on an IED. And some electrical tape had the partial fingerprint of an individual. That individual was in custody in Iraq for a different charge that unrelated to that. We were able to get that information to the DoD, and they upped the charges and held that individual for other purposes. So again, the system works. You get the data in there, you run that system, you're going to be able to get it. This individual was linked to an IED explosion, and so if you call that catching a terrorist, I guess it's certainly identifying one.
Okay, thank you. Chief
and, so, and I will say, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, in the course of its enforcement operations at and between the ports of entry over the years, has encountered individuals that have been known, either suspected, financiers, facilitators, and associated with terrorist organizations. It is a small percentage, by the way, very infrequent, but it has occurred.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to open it out to the audience now. Can you introduce yourself, and can we keep the questions focused on counterterrorism? Yes, sir.
My name is Chris Taylor. I'm with Mission Essential Personnel. I wonder if you could quickly, from each one of your four perspectives, tomorrow we implement a national guest worker program. What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages from each one of your perspectives?
A national guest worker program, again, that's not really my area of expertise. It's a policy call on how you might regulate immigration reform. That's something that's not on the horizon here.
Could you ramp up your systems to deal with a doubling or trebling of the numbers of people?
Sure. I mean, any guest worker program, to equate it back to what we do, certainly would have a biometric identifier in there, as any guest worker program does. Any lawful permanent resident who gets a green card goes through that process as well. So, the goods or bads of having a guest worker program is not something for me to comment on, but certainly from a support side of the house, we would be able to identify someone so that we're not having bad or terrorists trying to sneak in here as guest workers.
From the Terrorist Screening Center's perspective, we automatically already export the watch list. So this would just be a program that could be watched. Yeah, they would get part of the list in order to screen whether we would get the encounters and how many encounters that we would occur, could limit the number of personnel I would need to hire, the budgetary constraints, things like that. Would our numbers go higher from 150 to 175 to 2 to 250? Could we entertain that? Great. I don't know. But that is something that we would be able to export in the sense of we have that already in place if they wanted to use the data.
Dan, you don't represent the government, so you're not allowed to dodge the question.
I thought that was going to go a different way. I don't have a particular comment on it. From a policy perspective, I think from an industry perspective, to the extent that programs like that might get linked to things in the counterterrorism enterprise, I mean, we stand ready to help link, support IT systems, data, and to match data against other systems that exist elsewhere to make sure that anyone in those programs is properly vetted and looked at in terms of any national security risks and how it might affect their presence in the United States. Beyond that, I don't have any particular comments.
Chief Fisher?
From an operational standpoint, if a guest worker program reduces those individuals that otherwise would be coming in between the ports of entry in overwhelming numbers, and it reduces the flow rate by which our agents are now going to be encountering individuals, that would be a good thing.
And since I was accused of dodging the question here, we did do a pilot program on the southern border with Arizona, on the Arizona border, where we had these kiosks set up for a very compliant population. So these guest workers would H-2 visa holders, if they left on time and comply with their visa, and that process worked quite well. So there's ways for technology and for the program to help with the program should the policy decide to have a guest worker program.
Yes, sir.
I'm Chuck Wagner from Mission Essential Personnel. Admiral Olson talked yesterday about breaking down the doors that have existed between the CIA and the Special Operations community and being able to communicate much more freely. How are we doing on that with the operational end of the Border Patrol, knowing, for instance, the intelligence on the drug cartels, which might allow you to do predictive intelligence along the border?
We are just scratching the surface, but the future looks good on that. Matter of fact, when we're looking at how the military is perfecting find, fix, and finish, and how do we apply that within the law enforcement context. What's interesting is when you look at where these criminal organizations operate, what's really interesting, it's right there on the fringe between domestic law enforcement and international, and then where the collections community feels comfortable operating. And so our critical requirements are really right there in that hazy area, right across the border into those small border towns where the stash houses and where that tactical information needs to be, drawn, either UMINT or signals or however else we can get the information. And so as we work with the collection and the international community or the intelligence community about what our requirements are and where we can collect those, they start looking at, well, that might be a little bit too close to the border, and how much collection has this government really required from a contiguous country like Mexico. And so those are, slow changes, but clearly, we're not giving up on it, and we've seen remarkable changes just within the last few years in terms of information that clearly, as a Border Patrol agent, I mean, the best that I could hope for, back many, many years ago, was exchanging across the fence with my counterpart and hope to get some information about a load that was coming through. It certainly wasn't sustainable, wasn't anything that could be replicated across the board. But now we've got, binational commitments and country-to-country protocols that will institutionalize those things that relationships cannot continue as people change and organizations change. So I think the future looks good in that arena, and we're looking forward to the intelligence community to help us out in that regard.
Can I?
Just
Sure.
to add to that, our relationship with NCTC is very strong. We have an officer stationed over there, and they get access to all of the ATIS information, the arrival departure information systems data. So very, very strong relationship.
Can I just follow up, Chief Fisher? Do you, going forward, are you looking for the Border Patrol to develop its own intelligence capability, or to get more from existing intelligence agencies?
Well, I've always been the proponent. Anytime that and I'll just stick to CBP and specifically the Border Patrol, want to do something new and different, I always ask my staff to keep two things in mind. So the first thing, make sure that no matter what we do, it adds value and it doesn't duplicate effort. So in response to your question, we're not out to set up a whole new fusion center within the Border Patrol and do something. We have over the years established Border Patrol agents and intelligence functions basically because it was a requirement and we weren't receiving the information. It wasn't because the intelligence community didn't want to share with us, it's because we were too immature in our thinking and in our strategic thinking to recognize, to tell the community what information was important to us. And we're still trying to learn that, by the way. So what we do have in capabilities, I don't think can be duplicated outside of the Border Patrol. And that's not just because I'm a Border Patrol agent and we're proud. We operate and train in a very unique environment. We have Border Patrol agents that will go out there and find somebody after those individuals have crossed 2 or 3 hours later without any technological assistance, and they're very good at doing that. Now, what we're trying to do within the organization is train those 21,000 Border Patrol agents that they're also intelligence collections experts and need to be. That's a whole different cultural change within our organization. And if we can maximize that capability within our workforce, and we will be able to provide to the intelligence community a lot more information than they can do otherwise. And so I think there's going to be a very good reciprocal agreement as we get a lot more smarter about what we don't know about and how we can best leverage what we do have in terms of our capabilities, both in terms of protecting this country and in terms of playing within the intelligence community, and whatever role is legitimate as long as it adds value and doesn't duplicate effort.
And I'm sorry to interrupt
No.
also, but Sean, and I think Chief Fisher is selling himself short when it comes to CBP because they already are doing intelligence collection. We see that at the Terrorist Screening Center. So when somebody is stopped at the border and they're contacting the Terrorist Screening Center because it's a positive match or a potential match to the watch list, sometimes they get pocket litter, there's pictures involved, things like that. That is then passed on to us at the Terrorist Screening Center, which is then passed on to the case agent and back to the intelligence community and CTC. So there is a process, but it might not be as elaborate as Chief Fisher would like it to be going forward.
Dan.
I do think we've made enormous progress, sort of, as was mentioned last night, closing those gaps when it comes to sharing actionable information and being able to make decisions using information that's not possessed by one particular agency but maybe possessed somewhere else but is shared with you. I think going forward for the next 10 years, one thing to think about really hard is as the amount of data grows and the speed with which the data moves between different organizations in the government increases in a good way, I think there's going to be a need for greater harmonization and coordination around what currently are largely agency-specific data security rules, privacy and civil liberties rules, and data retention rules. Because if each node in that network has its own set of rules regarding how the data is managed, and increasingly organizations are using data that they don't necessarily own but are transferring or borrowing from somewhere else, it raises significant issues. In terms of maintaining the confidence of the American public on privacy issues, for example, I think there needs to be greater harmonization across those. So I think that's a gap that needs to be looked at for the next 10 years.
And I'm afraid that we are out of time. I would like to thank, from the bottom of my heart, my panel. And the organisers for inviting us all. And I think we have a 10-minute break now. Is that right? Yeah? Okay. Thanks.
We're going to head over to Pepke Auditorium, which if you just head out these doors, we have a bunch of our staff along the walkway. It's just past where we started last night in Greenwald. We're going to be there until 5:30 and then head back here for dinner, after which we'll head back to Pepke for the closing, for the film screening.